absolutely obnoxious. Can I do this? No, it's not gonna let me do it. God, what an absolute pain. And of course, it's not. It's something else. It really irritates me, uh, the amount of agents and setups and nested buttons you have to click to do all this configuration. It just drives me a little crazy. All right, welcome back to AZ-801. This is the second video in the monitoring and troubleshooting section of the AZ-801 exam content. My first video was on troubleshooting Active Directory. Check that one out. That one's pretty good. This one is not nearly as exciting. This is just about how to monitor and configure alerting on your VM. This does have some integration with Azure. It's kind of exciting, but otherwise it's just basically what tools are available and how do we use them. And specifically, the exam objectives seem to be concerned about metrics related tools, which to me is not very exciting. Watching CPU utilization of VM is never something I've been that interested in, but we'll get into it. Let's see what Windows has to offer us. So these are the topics we're going to cover. We're going to get into Performance Monitor. If you haven't used it, it can be kind of a bear, but it also does a lot and can be very extensible. I've used it occasionally to help troubleshooting things, so we'll go into how to configure that. We'll also talk about Windows Event Collection and what that means, basically using a single Windows server to collect Windows event logs from multiple servers so you have a central event management platform. We'll talk a little bit about Azure Monitor and get into how we install the agent and some additional tools that are available in Azure to monitor VMs once that agent is installed. And then finally, we will get back to Windows Admin Center, everyone's favorite server managing tool, and look at what sort of monitoring and alerting options you can configure from there, which does require an integration with Azure. With that being said, let's cut over to our management desktop and jump right into Performance Monitor. If I can find it. Found it. There we go. Okay. We are connected to Management P1. This is my lab management desktop. And I've already got most things configured, but we're going to start with Performance Monitor. This has been a tool that's been around Windows for quite a while, and you will be able to tell when we open it, it has a pretty old interface that has not been updated, but it does a lot of stuff. So, by default, Performance Monitor is used for analyzing metrics data related to hardware running on your VM. If I just click on Performance Monitor under Monitoring Tools right out the gate, you can see this little lovely animated line graph that is currently measuring percent of processor time. Now, the thing that makes this tool really powerful is the amount of different hardware statistics that you can view if you want to. And just to view in this chart, let's go ahead and click this Add button up here and look at all of the different potential options. These are all categories. So you've got USB, terminal services, TCP v4, SMB stuff, processes, objects. You have iSCSI target information, and each one of these also expands into a whole bunch of very specific hardware categories. So if I expand HTTP service, total URIs cached, URI cache hits, I can go to event log and see active subscriptions, events per second as a metric. If I go to, let's go to disk. There's no disk, so maybe it's drive or hard drive. I don't know. There's a bunch though. Let's just add one of these for the sake of. Actually, we'll do memory. Just for the sake of demonstration. We got a memory and maybe page reads per second. We'll add that too. Now that's a separate category. Lines up with the existing chart. I can also change the color on here to make this a little more obvious. And you see page reads per second just went up to 60 by changing the color. And then I can also change the graph here. So I can do a histogram bar, which it kind of shows over intervals the amount of data. I can also switch to just report, which just gives you live numbers on the metrics that you've selected. This is not that exciting, right? But this is a very quick demonstration. If you're just looking at tracking hardware statistics and you need something more than just going to task manager and performance, even though this is obvious, usually plenty, you can go in here and drill down. Now, what makes this really useful, or where you can use this in troubleshooting scenarios that kind of expands on what the information you just get out of Task Manager, is you can configure what are called data collector sets. Now, data collector sets are used to get predefined groups of the information. It's the same categories that we looked at in that last chart, where it's you have 1,000 different hardware statistics you can look at, but in this case you can create a user-defined data collector set that tracks a number of those categories that are pre-selected, and then you can do a number of things like that, like set this to run for a minute and stop, or set this to run for a certain criteria. Now, if I wanted to go, let's just create one of these for us to look at the walkthrough here. If I do create new data collector set, I'm just going to call it data collector set, and I do create manually, you have three options you can do. You event trace data, so you can do event data, configuration information, or performance counter. We're just going to do performance counters for now. Next, add. I get all of the same menu I have right here, right? As you can kind of tell from our previous demonstration, I'm not going to click through the screens. There's so many categories here that can be overwhelming unless you very specifically know what you're looking for. And this has been my experience in using it in the past, and this is why I haven't used it very often, is it's kind of daunting to even understand what these categories are. So unless you're specifically a monitoring hardware expert, it can be difficult to find stuff. But if I cancel out of this, let me cancel out of this and do a different data collector set. Instead of using a manual one that I'm going to create, let's create from template and hit next. And there are a few different sets of information or templates that come predefined with Windows. So I'm going to do system diagnostics. Even though technically there's another one over here on the left that's pre-created, I'm just going to create this as a template so we can kind of look at it and edit it. Hit next, next, and finish. I've got my data collector set. Now this has a whole bunch of information in it, right? I didn't have to click anything. It already has the configuration. Before I start this, let's go to properties and look at how this is configured. So it has a description. It talks to you about where it's going to save these logs. And then more specifically, once you've got these defined, you can go into a schedule and define how frequently you want these to run. And this is where they get cool. So I, in the past, have been assisting in troubleshooting an issue that would happen sporadically every day or so, and about at the same time of day. And so what I did is, we kind of had an idea it was network related, but it might be network, might be disk, might be memory. We didn't really know. So I curated one of these collector sets, had it track a number of vague general statistics about disk queue time or memory consumption or stuff like that. Created a whole bunch of categories I thought might be related to the problem. And then I came in here on a schedule and say, configure this to run about the same time of day, every day that we were encountering the issues. After that, you go to stop condition, and this kicks off the metrics where it will start tracking all those metrics over a period of time, and you set the interval, right? I believe those interval settings are in the metrics themselves, but then you set the stop condition as, I want this to run for 10 minutes, collect data all along at 10 minutes, and then stop and save it. And now you can go back and look at those reports. Or you can set it a limit on the maximum size or the duration, which I don't know what the difference is between duration and overall duration. Doesn't really matter. Either way, you set a stop time. In this case, the diagnostics one's a set for 10 minutes. I'm going to drop this down to 1 so we can run it and look at the report. Hit apply, hit OK, and let's kick this off and see what sort of information we get. Now, this is going to start running. When you kick off a data collector set, if you go to reports and user defined, this is where it's going to start saving them. So you can see it's already saving the information for this report as we go. The other thing that's kind of interesting here is, if I go to properties, one of these existing ones, there is a way, I don't think it's in there. If I look at these actual configurations here, one of these will tell me in XML format how the data is actually formatted. And of course, I'm not going to find it since I'm on the call. I was just looking at this the other day, though. Figures. I'm not going to be able to find this while I'm actually thinking about it. Um, Either way, these data collector sets, they're a collection of different information that you're trying to track, right? And as you're tracking them, you can just see that this stopped. So we'll look at that in a second. The information it's set to track is actually built in an XML template. And you can export the template. If I save this, so I can look at it, you can then organize the data that you're interpreting. So rather than just having that ugly little line graph that we saw earlier in the demonstration, which is the default view on this and can be really useless, especially if you're tracking like 15 different pieces of information, seeing that all display in the same graph, it makes it very cluttered and you have to find a filter out to get any information. That's one thing I really remember trying to use these in the past. If you want to do instead, you can create a template, and I believe this organizes the information you're interpreting into different categories. Like you can see this, each one of these configuration data collector categories is going to be a separate element in the report. So the reason I call that out is if you just create an advanced one, select a bunch of categories, it looks really ugly. But if we pull this report up that just generated, you can see it's got these all sorted into categories that you can then drill down into and get more valid information. Like if I just want the CPU statistics, I can go to CPU process and it organizes all these informations. All of this is defined in the XML template. I'm not going to get into today how to write an XML file, but if you are serious about analyzing metrics, and Performance Monitor is a great tool for that, it has a lot of information, you do have the ability to come in here and create these XML files that can then have the organization or the information sorted in a much more legible way than you'll just get out of the box. Because out of box reports, especially if you're clicking through, is going to look like this, which makes it very, very difficult to read. So that's really the gist of Performance Monitor in a nutshell. You don't need to know too much about this other than the fact that you have the ability to come in here, create these, schedule them, set stop conditions so you can set it how long you want it to run. It generates reports that you can then use to analyze your system. The ones that come out of the box give you a lot of information. So if you're just trying to get started, there's no reason you can't come up and spin up one of these reports and have it running and generate that information for yourself. Or set it on a schedule if you're encountering issues on a regular basis. That's Performance Monitor. Now, let's cut over and shift gears here. Our next thing we're going to talk about is Windows Event Collection, which to me is a much more useful thing. If I do any troubleshooting in a system nowadays, my very first thing that I do is open Event Viewer, leave it on this default screen, let this load. It always takes a bit. This takes especially a long time if you're trying to load Event Viewer on another computer. I don't ever do remote management for Event Viewer for that reason. It takes forever. But I pull up this screen, leave it on the default one, expand errors, and start looking, okay, what errors am I seeing in event logs on the machine? This is my first stop for troubleshooting, almost universally. Now, if you're in an enterprise organization, it's likely that you have a SIEM solution like Splunk, something that aggregates all of your logs from different sources and lets you very quickly sort through and search through those logs for different events. So like we have at my company, Splunk, we ingest logs from Active Directory, we ingest logs from our wireless authentication, we ingest logs from our NetScaler and our AD Connect server, all of these stuff in one spot. And that way, if I have a user who's having an issue or something changed in that user, I need to figure out what changed or who changed it or when it changed, I can go to search, type in the user's name, and I get it searches all of the logs we've aggregated in one spot and gives me a report. And then I can drill down and find out what changed, right? You have the ability to do something very similar with event collectors. The difference is you're going to be using this event viewer interface and you are to configure the collector and the source of the logs, or the initiator, well, the collector, initiator, and source. So let's get into that. Now, there are some Active Directory permissions required, and there's two different ways to configure this. If I go to subscriptions, first going to prompt me, I don't have my subscription collector running, so I'm going to hit yes here. It sets the service to run and starts it. If I create a subscription, which we're not going to finish yet, but I'm just going to walk through sample. There's two ways of doing this. I have to name it, but the two different methods, I can use a collector initiated, meaning if this management server is going to collect the logs for me, I can have this server initiate that connection and say, reach out to the computers I select, grab the logs I want, and bring them back, and then aggregate them here. The other way you can do it is you can use source computer initiated, and this means you configure a group policy that says go out to and send your logs to this source, and you provide the source. In this case, it's going to be your collector computer, but you have to do that in a very specific format. Believe I have the format pulled up. So we're going to try doing both. And the reason I say we're going to try doing both, I could not get this source computer initiated one working. I don't know if it was a delay, it was something to do with permissions or other. So we're going to configure both so you can see it, but I have a feeling only the collector initiated one is going to work for now. But let's jump to it. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to come back to this later. So close this, minimize, and let's open group policy and configure the GPO we need for source initiated log collection. And go to my group policy console. And for the sake of our demonstration, we're going to kind of go through the same demo that I talked about with Splunk. So I'm going to go to my domain controllers, and I'm going to create a policy that says send me your security logs, so that if I want to audit those logs, I can look in my event collector and look at all the logs in one spot. So let's create a GPO and link it. Call it event collection. It's not a great name for naming standards, but it's clear enough. Edit, and this is going to be an admin template, Windows component, and event forwarding. There's two settings. I don't really care about the resource usage. What I want to do is configure a target for the subscription manager. I'm going to enable this, and all I have to do, I can configure multiple targets here, but all I have to do is copy and paste this URL. I will include this link down in the description, by the way. And let's paste that in here. And what we've got here is server equals, and then you've got your FQDN of your server. This is going to be for me, management p1.dzab.local. This port is dictated by the document. I'll let you check this. This basically means talk over HTTP. I don't have HTTPS configured in my environment. That's fine. And then you also have the option, if you're using HTTPS, to specify the issuing CA cert if you're doing some sort of authentication. This should work for our environment the way it's set. I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to hit apply, and now this is running. However, the other part you need on top of the group policy is permissions, and what those permissions specifically are the permissions to read event logs. Now, I've already started to configure this, but I will talk through that when I pull this up. So if I go to my built-in groups, if you recall back to the Active Directory videos we did, built-in groups are basically exactly the same as local groups on a Windows server. The difference is once a domain controller has been promoted, it no longer has local groups. Those local groups get converted to being built-in groups. And built-in groups are basically the local permissions to manage domain controllers, and they're shared across all domain controllers in your domain. So if you're doing this on local computers, you need to configure permissions in the local group for event log readers. If you're doing it for domain controllers, you need to go into the built-in domain groups for event log readers and add it there. The one thing I've added already is an NT authority for network service. This is because the WinRM instance that powers event log collections runs as a network service, so the network service on a domain controller needs permissions to read the logs on the domain controllers in order to send them. I came in here and configured this already because I have to be able to I have to restart the computer for it to register as a member of this group. So I added this, restarted the domain controllers. They should be ready. But that would only work for source initiated event logs. So if we get that subscription and it works, this should be just fine. However, I also want to configure collector initiated event logs, meaning I want the event log collector itself to be able to reach out and gather logs. So I'm going to add that management P1 server as well. So add, make sure I check the box for computers, management P1, check, apply, OK. And ironically, I don't appear not to need to restart this the server to recognize that it's a member of that group. It's really weird, but it works. Normally, if you add a computer to a group, you have to restart it, otherwise it'll never refresh its group membership. Either that or run klist purge something specific. There's a command outlet you can Google if you want to. All right, but that's it. We've got our event collection GPO, which basically says if you're in the domain controllers OU, send your logs to this server for its event log collection based on the subscription settings. And then we have our Active Directory permissions, which include permissions for the domain controllers to send those logs and also the permissions for the management server to collect them itself. So we should be good. Let's go switch back to our event viewer console now. We're already on the management server, and let's configure subscriptions. This is the part that actually configures the gathering of the logs. So the first thing let's do is we'll create a subscription, and we're going to try this source computer initiated. Technically, this should work because we have permissions. So let's say from DCs, and I'm going to add domain computers. And I have to add them individually. You can't add multiple. It's kind of a pain. So ADP1, ADP2. I'm going to hit OK. And then the last step we have to do here is select what events we want sent. Now, I'm going to configure this twice, right? I'm going to configure source initiated and collector initiated subscriptions. So I'm going to configure these to collect two different sets of logs. The first one, let's just do Windows application logs. And we'll do all events. That's fine. And then I also want them just from the last 12 hours because who cares? This is fine. Hit OK. And that's all we have to do. Hit OK. Now I have my first subscription set up. This is a source initiated event log subscription. Now I'm going to create a second one. This is going to be collector initiated. So that's meaning the management server is going to reach out and grab the logs versus having them sent to him. We're going to do the same steps. So add the two servers. And this one I know is going to work. So I'm actually going to do the logs that I would actually care about, which are going to be security logs, because that's all of your login authentication attempts and stuff from the domain controllers. These are the logs that I would actually be interested in if it was in production. And I'm also going to set this to last 12 hours just to narrow the range. All event IDs, that's good, that's good. Hit OK. All right, I got my computers, got my events. So let me just name this DC security logs. Hit OK. And you'll see right away the difference that popped up. In this column it says source computers, and it has 2. Now, I can right click this and go to runtime status and view, is this working? And in this case, it looks like both of these are working and active. So I should be getting these security logs very soon. However, just to see if I can get this working, hey, I didn't even need to check. It looks like this updated as well. So I think the difference is the first time I set this up, when I went to the group policy and I had to specify the subscription source, the directions have a server equals and then that HTTP URL path. I'm pretty sure I skipped the server equals and just added HTTP. Apparently, that was the secret sauce because it looks like this is working. So, if I switch to my Windows log and forwarded events, I should see logs from both the application logs, which is the source initiated one, and the security logs, which is the collector initiated one. Let's see. Look at that. I've got my application logs. That means my GPO for source initiated logs did work. And so it did appear to be that server FQDN thing. Now, do I see any security logs? Not yet. But that's okay. Like I said, we see the source computers listed there. So it should just be a matter of time until they start popping up. If I refresh this, I'm not going to worry. Either way, that's how you do log event collection. Now, I have the ability under my forwarded events category over here to do whatever I'd normally do if I'm looking at logs. I can do filtering based on ID, I can search, I can drill down by time. However you normally analyze logs for troubleshooting is now available in one spot, and I'm collecting this data from both servers. This is only showing me ADP2, so there's one from ADP1. I wonder if I need to run a group policy update on that. So let's switch over and just fire that off just to be safe. Cool. That's updated. I don't actually care about user policy because it's a computer policy. So that's going to run. We'll see. We'll check back here in a few minutes and see if these logs updated. I expect it's just a matter of time until I start getting security logs in here too. But that's Windows Event Collection in a nutshell. Next thing we're going to look at is Azure Monitor. we're going to go take a look at some of the Azure Monitor tools, and then we're going to cut back here and do a little bit of configuration in Windows Admin Center, which it wants you to know how to configure monitoring alerting. But it makes more sense in my mind to start at the admin portal for Azure. So let's cut over to my browser here, and cool. I've got, these are the instructions up. I'll post this link in the description. Let's go over to Azure. Here's Entra. I don't want Entra. I want resource groups. All right. Here's my lab resource group with all the lab VMs that I have running right now. Now, let's open our management server, and there's a couple of objectives that it wants you to call it specifically. It wants you to know how to configure diagnostic settings. It wants you to know how to configure VM Insights, and it wants you to know how to do Azure monitoring. Now, Azure monitoring and VM Insights are essentially the same thing. Whenever you hear Azure Monitor, my brain always goes to metric information, CPU, disk queue length, RAM, that sort of information. Diagnostic settings, when you hear that reference, that's talking about logging information. So events, issues that have come up, anything that's more log oriented or event oriented rather than just numbers. And those are two important differences to understand. Logs versus metrics. So if you think back to our performance monitor tool, that's all metrics data. That's Azure Monitor information. But to do any of this stuff, we need to set up first what's called the Azure Monitor agent. Now, most VMs come with an old log analytics agent that needs to get updated. But to get this agent installed, there's multiple mechanisms. Generally, if you're doing this in production and you want to do it on all of your VMs, because it doesn't make sense to do this on an individual VM by VM basis, you're going to go into Azure Policy. I've got Azure Policy videos I can link that you can go look at if you're interested in doing that. And then you configure Azure Policy to configure the new Azure Monitor agent on all VMs by default. However, for the sake of demonstration, we're just going to do it here. And to do it on an individual VM, it's actually kind of tedious because you can't just click a button to enable it. You have to go first into Monitoring and Insights. And from here, you can click on Analyze Data, and you actually need to enable the agent. Now, you'll notice I don't have any data here because I'm using an old log analyst agent, which doesn't work. So the way I've discovered and the way I've navigated the portal to find that agent, I have to click on Azure Monitor. I wasn't able to find a quick way to do this, so that's why I'm going to click through here. Once you're in this Azure Monitor tab, go to Overview, no, Get Started, and Configure Insights, and now it takes me to Overview. A little bit of clicking, and I've got my VMs listed here. Now, let's start by just enabling one. You'll also notice I have a workspace specified here already. That was from a previous instance where I deleted it and recreated it, but it seems like the link was restored once I did that, so that's fine. So I'm going to click Enable here, I'm going to click Enable here, and it will install that Azure Monitor agent and also ask you to set a data collection rule. This is very similar to our data collection rule set from Performance Monitor, but this time it has a default one that is configured. I think that's fine, so I'm going to hit Configure, and it is going to initialize, deploy the agent, start running those data collector sets. Now, the other thing that I have to do is that this is going to be used for VM Insights and Azure Monitor performance data, metric data. The other objective they want you to know is how to configure diagnostic logging. Now, this is a good category to know. Diagnostic settings are universal in Azure, meaning if you're doing logging data on any resource, subscriptions, I don't know about resource groups because they're kind of qualified with subscriptions, but any PaaS service, any IaaS service, storage accounts, whatever you want to think of in Azure, they all have diagnostic settings that you'd use. It's all the same spot. So let's close this. I'll come back to this in a second. We'll go back to Management P1, and under Monitoring, I have diagnostic settings. This is the option that's in like every single resource in Azure, and it's the same mechanism for configuring logging. So the first thing I have to do is select a storage account. I don't want to use any of these storage accounts, so what I will do is create a new one. It looks like my VM Insights deployment succeeded, so that should be ready for us in a little bit. Azure Labs, VM diag logs. Yeah, this is has to be a universal name, and can't have hyphens. There we go. All right, and I'm going to make cheap settings. Next, sure. Next. I don't care about soft delete because I'm not going to keep this stuff. Next. In production, obviously you'd spin this up with Terraform or IAC just in general, so you don't have to click the next finish sort of setup. This is going to deploy. This shouldn't take very long, so let's switch back to the management server, and I will revisit that once we look at these insights. So now that VM insights configuration is done, I'm going to scroll back down over here to insights. We'll click on this, and let's analyze data. And what we should see, starting here soon, is CPU utilization information. Not yet. Let's make sure if we go here, I want my correct subscription, resource group, virtual machine. It says not monitored. Let's try this again. No. Gas performance enabled, process independent maps, edit. I want my insights on. I want subscription correct. Let's create a different rule that does enable process independency. I'm not really a fan of login its workspace. Sure. I'm not really a fan of doing this in the portal because it really is messy. It feels like you're nesting into like 3 or 4 different consoles. It's not obvious the buttons you have to set up, and really they don't make this an easy transition. This really is something you should be configuring with policy. It saves you all this clicking, and then you set it once and it's enabled for all VMs out of the box, and you don't have to worry about, did I have this configured correctly? So let's re-enable that. That deployment is in process. Cool. We'll check back here in a second. Let's go back to diagnostic settings now that we have our storage account and configure dzab diag, enable guest level monitoring, and now this will do both. So it does look like it also collects host level metrics, but it should also be events and event driven data. So for more insights of virtual machine, you can collect guest level metrics, logs, other diagnostic data using diagnostics agent. So I'm pretty sure it's going to configure all of that, but this is in the portal where you go to configure these settings if you're doing it on a VM by VM basis. This is going to take a little while. You can see it's installing the extensions, and as a reminder, VM extensions are essentially the same as a Windows Admin Center extensions. They increase the functionality by adding custom add-ons to your VM. So I use the join domain extension when I create them, which after creation it joins the domain. Your Azure Monitor agent is an extension. This has guest diagnostic settings. It looks like now that my agent is installed, I have a bunch of options. So this is saying collect logs. It has my storage account, has my database. I can remove the diagnostic agent if I want, but it also has performance counters. This is the information it's gathering. I've got logs. These are the logs it's taking. That's pretty cool. I can optionally choose to do IIS or application logs. You have event tracing if you want it, crash dumps, and syncs. So just by coming in here and enabling diagnostic settings and pushing the agent extension, it enables your ability to collect all of these information, which now you can aggregate that information and query against it in the portal. Let's go back to the insights and see if that has kicked off correctly. So here we go. Okay, so it did start. I have a feeling it was already running, but there's too much of it. It hadn't ran for long to get information. But we can see we are starting to get IOP information, logical disk, megabit per second, all of the sort of metric data that you would expect to get under VM Insights. Now, the other thing that's cool about this that I noticed, and the reason I've made a custom data collector rule, and I don't know if this is going to show up yet, is if I go to map, this might not be working yet. Yeah, we're going to check back this later. Essentially what this is going to do is this will show you a connection of all of the different interfaces or connections your VM is making to other servers or machines on your domain or that have direct network connection to it. We're going to check back on that one because this is pretty cool when you see it. But in a nutshell, this is your monitoring setup for Azure. You've got diagnostic settings for logs, and it requires an extension. You have Azure Monitor, which requires an agent, and you use that to configure VM Insights, which gives you these sort of metric performance mapping. All of this requires agents and extensions that should be pushed through policy. Let's cut back to our management desktop and let's take a look in Windows Admin Center because there's the ability to create these and monitor them from there. So let me cut back here. And I believe I already have Windows Admin Center open. Yep. And what I've done here is I set this up. I also enabled the registration. If you're wondering about how to set up Windows Admin Center, I have another video on that I will link in a card here. And that goes through the whole setup and configuration. It also talks about how you do the Azure integration piece. I've already done that to save ourselves a little bit of time in this video. But if I open this server, let this load, it will have on the left hand side here, I have a performance monitor, and this is going to be the same performance monitor that you get from your existing, just like perfmon, right? You can use this to do the same thing where you specify stats that you want to track, but for what we're interested in here, the specific exam objectives is monitoring and alerting. So if I click on Azure Monitor here, it says setup. Let me select the work group I already have. So use existing. What I'm doing here is linking this to a log analyst workspace. Oh, let me set this. I was wondering why it wasn't showing up. It bothers me because it says install the Microsoft Monitoring Agent and Dependency Agent. I'm pretty sure it already had, but it's not going to. And it's of course going to make me create a new log analyst workspace because I can't find the existing one, which is absolutely obnoxious. Let me just switch back here because I created this already and it already linked it too. So what if I use the one that I already created? Can I do this? No, it's not gonna let me do it. God, what an absolute pain. Let's go ahead and set that up. Now, this is running. Let's go down here on the left-hand side to System Insights. And let's see if this works, because this should be using the same VM Insights agent that I did just configure in the portal. And of course, it's not. It's something else. It really irritates me the amount of agents and setups and nested buttons you have to click to do all this configuration. It just drives me a little crazy. Part of the reason I did the Azure Monitor portion before I did this is because I was under the assumption Windows Admin Center would utilize the same extensions and agents that the Azure portal is using. It's called the same thing, monitoring, insights. Why wouldn't it be the same here? But of course, it's Microsoft doing Microsoft things. You have to install 16,000 different random things, and there's not a clear way of doing it. Anyways, rant off. I won't bother with it anymore. Let's just see what we can do here. So, you enable System Insights. This is kind of the same type of view as VM Insights. It gives you like the ability to do capacity planning and evaluate what you're doing. Now, by default, when you install this, none of these are enabled. But let's go ahead and turn on all of them. So, invoke, 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 invoke. And what is this doing? CPU capacity forecasting. It looks like it is set to remain within the available capacity, meaning this is tracking how much CPU have you used recently, how much do you think you're going to use, should you increase the CPU and size up the VM. Network capacity, check back again later. We don't have enough data. That makes sense, right? It's tracking how much data is being consumed by the network, it will report back later. But this gives you a really handy just checkbox. Now, I've never used this add remove capability. It looks like you've got the ability to do physical disk, anomaly detections with IOPS or latency. So there's a couple more you can add. I imagine if Microsoft is serious about expanding Windows Admin Center, you'll probably see more of these grow. But the fact that this is not tied to something existing in the Azure portal makes me very skeptical that this is going to scale well. Because you think about how much stuff Microsoft already has to manage, why would you make this information separate than what you're already doing in the portal that you know is managed and has a team dedicated to upkeeping it? All right. So this is the VM Insights portion. Let's go back to Azure Monitor. See if this is set up yet. It is. Okay, cool. So I don't know what you're supposed to do with this, right? It does say you can edit alerts here, but generally speaking, the way you edit alerts with Azure is you configure it to check for a threshold, and then if the threshold is breached, it triggers what's called an action group, which is basically just Azure's settings mapping an alert to either an email or text message, some mechanism for sending out alerts. That's an action group in Azure. Now, I have the ability to edit alert rule, and I can use an existing action rule, which I've already got, but of course it's not going to find it. I wonder if this is a setting issue with like the app registration in Azure. Whatever. Annoying. Either way, I create a new one, I can name it, and then I specify an email recipient, and then it will send it to me. But I can't actually configure alerts here. This is kind of useless because it says monitoring alerting in Windows Admin Center. But if you go back here to view alerts, including alerts created in Azure, visit the Azure portal. I can't create alerts here. So what is the point? So let's go back to our Azure portal. I'm not going to do that here, actually. Let's copy a link. Switch back here. Actually, I'm going to keep that tab open. And here, under my login as workspace, alerts, I can create an alert rule. And this is based off the metrics data it's collecting. So it looks like it's free space. These are all tables in your login as workspace that it's writing to. So let's just say percent used space total is greater than 90%. That threshold is static, sure. Window value event, check every 1 minute, loopback period 5 minutes, and then next you trigger your action groups. See, I do have an action group. That actually is, oh, interesting. So when I cleared out these VMs, apparently it erased the action group that I had, which doesn't really make sense unless the action group is somehow tied to the login as workspace. Either way, I can create an action group here, link it to an email, and now whenever, I'm not going to finish this because I'm a little already annoyed with the Azure portal. But you link this to an email, and then when disk size usage gets past 90%, my disk is almost full, it's going to trigger an alert via an email, text message, something to say, hey, go fix this, go address it. And that's how monitoring alerting works in Azure. It does look like it's based off of the login as workspace itself rather than the VM or the Azure Monitor instance. And this seems like a different type of login as workspace. The fact that I wasn't able to find it, it's in the same subscription, access control mode, pricing tier. I just don't understand how this is different and why I wasn't able to search it out. There's infrastructure insights. Oh, it's a solution instead of a login as workspace. No, there it is. So obviously, there is more clarification I can figure out for getting this stuff to work. But just for the sake of doing a demo and what monitoring is available, hopefully this is enough to get you started. I can't imagine there's going to be a lot in the exams related to this because it does really seem like it's in flux. I think the most important things to note are, and this is the end of the content for the video, so the most important things to note based on what we just saw, specifically for the Azure portal. In order to use Azure Monitor, you have to install the Azure Monitor agent, right? To use VM Insights, it requires the Azure Monitor agent, also requires a login as workspace. To use diagnostic settings, requires a login as workspace, also requires a diagnostics agent. If you're going to use Windows Admin Center and do monitoring there, you have to do its own installation, and it appears to also need a dedicated Log Analytics Workspace. So all of this stuff tied back to Log Analytics Workspace requires VM agents or extensions to be installed. As long as you get the gist of that, I think that's going to be just fine for the sake of knowing the exam. The other stuff about performance monitor, event log collections, that stuff hasn't changed in forever. You can do that in any, and that really is probably consistent exam objectives you'll probably see questions related to. That's all I'm going to cover for this specific monitoring alerting section. There's one other section for the monitoring and troubleshooting exam objectives, and that's specifically looking at how you do monitoring and troubleshooting on Azure VMs, because that's apparently different than what we were doing right here. But mostly that's going to be running through, if you're trying to do this, this is the tool you need. If you're trying to do this, this is the tool you need. So that'll be probably a pretty quick video. That'll be coming up next, if not today, then probably a little bit later next week. Thanks for watching. Sorry this end of this kind of went off the rails as we're trying to click through the Azure portal. I always appreciate a like and subscribe, and feel free to check out some of the other videos I've linked. Thanks.